DEARTH'S Farm by Gerald Bullet. Read by Huw Carr. Directed by Brenden James. It is really not far. Our fast train does it in 80 minutes. But so sequestered is the little valley in which I have made my solitary home that I never go to town without the delicious sensation of poising my hand over a lucky bag full of old memories. In the train, I amuse myself by summoning up some of those ghosts of the past, a past not distant, but sufficiently remote in atmosphere from my present to be invested with a certain sentimental glamour. Perhaps I shall meet you, or you. But never yet have I succeeded in guessing what London held up her sleeve for me. She has that happiest of tricks, without which paradise will be dull indeed, the trick of surprise. In London, if in no other place, it is the unexpected that happens. For me, Fleet Street is the scene par excellence of these adventurous encounters, and it was in Fleet Street, 3 months ago, that I ran across Bailey of Queens, whom I hadn't seen for 5 years. Bailey is not his name, nor Queens his college, but these names will serve to reveal what is germane to my purpose, and to conceal the rest. His recognition of me was instant, mine of him more slow. He told me his name twice, we stared at each other, and I struggled to disguise the blankness of my memory. The situation became awkward. I was the more embarrassed because I feared lest he should too odiously misinterpret my non-recognition of him, for the man was shabby and unshaven enough to be suspicious of an intentional slight. Bailey. Now who the devil was Bailey? And then, when he had already made a gesture of moving on, memory stirred to activity. Oh, of course, I remember Bailey. Theosophy. You used to talk to me about theosophy, didn't you? I remember perfectly now. I glanced at my watch. If you're not busy, let's go and have some tea somewhere. He smiled, with a hint of irony in his eyes, as he answered, I'm not busy. I received the uncomfortable impression that he was hungry, and with no ordinary hunger, and the idea kept me silent, like an awkward schoolboy, while we walked together to a tea shop that I knew. Seated on opposite sides of the tea table, we took stock of each other. He was thin, and his hair graying. His complexion had a soiled, unhealthy appearance. The cheeks had sunk in a little, throwing into prominence the high cheekbones above which his sensitive eyes glittered with a new light, a light not of heaven. Compared with the Bailey I now remembered so well, a rather sleek young man with an almost feline love of luxury, blossoming like a tropical plant in the exotic atmosphere of his Cambridge rooms. Compared with that man, this was but a pale wraith. In those days, he had been a flaming personality, suited well, too well for my plain taste, to the highly colored Orientalism that he affected in his mural decorations. And coexistent in him with this lust for soft cushions and chromatic orgies which repelled me, there was an imagination that attracted me, an imagination delighting in highly colored metaphysical theories of the universe. These theories, which were as fantastic as the Arabian Nights and perhaps as unreal, proved his academic undoing. He came down badly in his trippos and had to leave without a degree. Many a man has done that and yet prospered, but Bailey, it was apparent, hadn't prospered. I made the conventional inquiries, adding, "It must be 6 or 7 years since last we met." "More than that," said Bailey morosely, and lapsed into silence. "Look here," he burst out suddenly. "I'm going to behave like a cad. I'm going to ask you to lend me a £1 note, and don't expect to get it back in a hurry." We both winced a little as the note changed hands. "You've had bad luck," I remarked, without, I hope, a hint of pity in my voice. "What's wrong?" He eyed me over the rim of his teacup. "I look a lot older to you, I expect." "You don't look very fit," I conceded. "No, I don't." His cup came down with a nervous slam upon the saucer. "Going grey too, aren't I?" I was forced to nod in agreement. "Yet, do you know, a month ago there wasn't a grey hair on my head. You write stories, don't you? I saw your name somewhere. I wonder if you could write my story. You may get your money back after all. By God, that would be funny, wouldn't it?" I couldn't see the joke, but I was curious about his story. And after we had lit our cigarettes, he told it to me, to the accompaniment of a driving storm of rain that tapped like 1,000 idiot fingers upon the plate glass windows of the shop. "A few weeks ago," said Bailey, "I was staying at the house of a cousin of mine. I never liked the woman, but I wanted free board and lodging, and hunger soon blunts the edge of one's delicacy. She's at least 10 years my senior, and all I could remember of her was that she had bullied me when I was a child into learning to read. 10 years ago, she married a man named DEARTH'S, James DEARTH'S, the resident owner of a smallish farm in Norfolk, not far from the coast. All her relatives opposed the marriage. Relatives always do. If people waited for the approval of relatives before marrying, the world would be depopulated in a generation. This time, it was religion. My cousin's people were primitive and methodical in their religion, as the name of their sect confessed, whereas DEARTH professed a universal toleration that they thought could only be a cloak for indifference. I have my own opinion about that, but it doesn't matter now. When I met the man, I forgot all about religion. I was simply repelled by the notion of any woman marrying so odd a being. Rather small in build, he possessed the longest and narrowest face I have ever seen on a man of his size. His eyes were set exceptionally wide apart, and the nose, culminating in large nostrils, made so slight an angle with the rest of his face that, seen in profile, it was scarcely human. Perhaps I exaggerate a little, but I know no other way of explaining the peculiar revulsion he inspired in me. He met me at the station in his dog cart and wheezed a greeting at me. "You're Mr. Bailey, aren't you? I hope you've had an agreeable journey. Monica will be delighted." This seemed friendly enough, and my host's conversation during that 8-mile drive did much to make me forget my first distaste of his person. He was evidently a man of wide reading, and he had a habit of polite deference that was extremely flattering, especially to me, who had had more of my share of the other thing. I was cashiered during the war, you know. Never mind why. Whenever he laughed, which was not seldom, he exhibited a mouthful of very large, regular teeth. DEARTH'S farm, to give it the local name, is a place with a personality of its own. Perhaps every place has that. Sometimes I fancy that the earth itself is a personality or a community of souls locked fast in a dream from which at any moment they may awake, like volcanoes, into violent action. Anyhow, DEARTH'S farm struck me as being peculiarly personal, because I found it impossible not to regard its climactic changes as changes of mood. You remember my theory that chemical action is only physical action seen from without? Well, I'm inclined to think in just the same way of every manifestation of natural energy. But you don't want to hear about my fancies. The farmhouse, which is approached by a narrow, winding lane from the main road, stands high up in a kind of shallow basin of land, a few acres ploughed, but mostly grass. The countryside has a gentle prettiness more characteristic in the southeastern counties. On three sides, wooded hills slope gradually to the horizon. On the fourth side, grassland rises a little for 20 yards and then curves abruptly down. To look through the windows that give out upon the fourth side is to have the sensation of being on the edge of a steep cliff, or at the end of the world. On a still day, when the sun is shining, the place has a languid beauty, an afternoon atmosphere. You remember Tennyson's Lotus Isles, in which it seemed always afternoon. DEARTH'S farm has something of that flavor on a still day. But such days are rare. The 2 or 3 I experienced shine like jewels in my memory. Most often, that stretch of 50 or 60 acres is a gathering ground for all the bleak winds of the earth. They seem to come simultaneously from the land and from the sea, which is 6 miles away, and they swirl round in that shallow basin of earth, as I've called it, like maddened devils seeking escape from a trap. When the storms were at their worst, I used to feel as though I were perched insecurely on a gigantic saucer held 100 miles above the earth. But I am not a courageous person. Monica, my cousin, found no fault with the winds. She had other fears, and I had not been with her 3 days before she began to confide them to me. Her overtures were as surprising as they were unwelcome. For that she was not a confiding person by nature, I was certain. Her manners were reserved to the point of diffidence, and we had nothing in common save a detestation of the family from which we had both sprung. I suppose you will want to know something of her looks. She was a tall, full-figured woman, handsome for her years, with jet black hair, a sensitive face, and a complexion almost southern in its dark coloring. I love beauty, and I found pleasure in her mere presence, which did something to lighten for me the gloom that pervaded the house. But my pleasure was innocent enough, and DEARTH'S watchdog airs only amused me. Monica's eyes, unfathomable pools, seemed troubled whenever they rested on me, whether by fear or by some other emotion I didn't at first know. She chose her moment well, coming to me when Dearth was out of the house, looking after his men, and I, pleading a headache, had refused to accompany him. The malady was purely fictitious, but I was bored with the fellow's company and sick of being dragged at his heels like a dog for no better reason than his too evident jealousy afforded. "I want to ask a kindness of you," she said. "Will you promise to answer me quite frankly?" I wondered what the deuce was coming, but I promised, seeing no way out of it. "I want you to tell me," she went on, "whether you see anything queer about me, about my behavior. Do I say or do anything that seems to you odd?" Her perturbation was so great that I smiled to hide my perception of it. I answered jocularly, "Nothing at all odd, my dear Monica, except this question of yours. What makes you ask it?" But she was not to be shaken so easily out of her fears, whatever they were. "And do you find nothing strange about this household either?" "Nothing strange at all," I assured her. "Your marriage is an unhappy one, but so are thousands of others. Nothing strange about that." "What about him?" she said, and her eyes seemed to probe for an answer. I shrugged my shoulders. "Are you asking for my opinion of your husband? A delicate thing to discuss." "We're speaking in confidence, aren't we?" She spoke impatiently, waving my politeness away. "Well, since you ask, I don't like him. I don't like his face. It's a parody on mankind, and I can't explain why you threw yourself away on him." She was eager to explain. "He wasn't always like this. He was a gifted man, with brains and an imagination. He still is, for all I know. You spoke of his face. Now, how would you describe his face in one word?" I couldn't help being tickled by the comedy of the situation, a man and a woman sitting in solemn conclave, seeking a word by which to describe another man's face, and that man her husband. But her air of tragedy, though I thought it ridiculous, sobered me. I pondered her question for a while, recalling to my mind's eye the long, narrow physiognomy and the large teeth of Dearth. At last, I ventured the word I had tried to avoid. "Equine," I suggested. There was a world of relief in her voice. "You have seen it too." She told me a queer tale. Dearth, it appears, had a love and understanding of horses that was quite unparalleled. His wife, too, had loved horses, and it had once pleased her to see her husband's astonishing power over the creatures, a power which he exercised always for their good. But his benefactions to the equine race were made at a hideous cost to himself, of which he was utterly unaware. Monica's theory was too fantastic even for me to swallow, and I, as you know, have a good stomach for fantasy. You will have already guessed what it was. Dearth was growing, by a process too gradual and subtle for perception, into the likeness of the horses with whom he had so complete sympathy. This was Mrs. Dearth's notion of what was happening to her husband, and she pointed out something significant that had escaped my notice. She pointed out that the difference between him and the next man was not altogether, or even mainly, a physical difference. In effect, she said, "If you scrutinize the features more carefully, you will find them to be far less extraordinary than you now suppose. The poison is not in his features. It is in the physical atmosphere he carries about with him, something which infects you with the idea of horses and makes you impose that idea on his appearance, magnifying his facial peculiarities." Just now I mentioned that in the early days of her marriage, Monica had shared his love of horses. Later, of course, she came to detest them, only 1 degree less than she detested her husband. That is saying much. Only a few months before my visit, matters had come to a crisis between the two. Without giving any definite reason, she had confessed under pressure that he was unspeakably offensive to her, and since then they had met only at meals, and always reluctantly. She shuddered to recall that interview, and I shuddered to imagine it. I was no longer surprised that she had begun to entertain doubts of her own sanity. But this wasn't the worst. The worst was Dandy, the white horse. I found it difficult to understand why a white horse should alarm her. I began to suspect that the nervous strain she had undergone was making her inclined to magnify trifles. "It's his favorite horse," she said. "That's as much as saying that he dotes on it to a degree that is unhuman. It never does any work. It just roams the field by day and at night sleeps in the stable." Even this didn't, to my mind, seem a very horrible indictment. If the man was mad on horses, what more natural than this petting of a particular favorite? A fine animal, too, as Monica herself admitted. "Roams the fields," cried my poor cousin urgently, "or did, until these last few weeks. Lately has been kept in the stable, day in, day out, eating its head off and working up energy enough to kill us all." This sounded to me like the language of hysteria, but I waited for what was to follow. "The day you came, did you notice how pale I looked? I had had a fright. As I was crossing the yard with a pail of separated milk for the calves, the beast broke loose from the stable and sprang at me. Yes, Dandy. He was in a fury. His eyes burned with ferocity. I dodged him by a miracle, dropped the pail and ran back to the house shrieking for help. When I entered the living room, my husband feigned to be waking out of sleep. He didn't seem interested in my story, and I'm convinced that he had planned the whole thing." It was past my understanding how Dearth could have made his horse spring out of a stable and make a murderous attack upon a particular woman, and I said so. "You don't know him yet," retorted Monica, "and you don't know Dandy. Go and look at the beast. Go now, while James is out." The farmyard, with its pool of water covered in green slime, its manure and sodden straw, and its smell of pigs, was a place that seldom failed to offend me. But on this occasion I picked my way across the cobblestones, thinking of nothing at all but the homicidal horse that I was about to spy upon. I have said before that I am not a courageous man, and you'll understand that I stepped warily as I neared the stable. I saw that the lower of the two doors was made fast, and with the more confidence unlatched the other. I peered in. The great horse stood bolt upright, but apparently in a profound sleep. It was indeed a fine creature, with no spot or shadow, as far as I could discern, to mar its glossy whiteness. I stood there, staring and brooding for several minutes, wondering if both Monica and I were the victims of some astounding hallucination. I had no fear at all of Dandy, after having seen him, and it didn't alarm me when presently his frame quivered, his eyes opened, and he turned to look at me. But as I looked into his eyes, an indefinable fear possessed me. The horse stared dumbly for a moment, and his nostrils dilated. Although I half expected him to tear his head out of the halter and prance round upon me, I could not move. I stared, and as I stared, the horse's lips moved back from the teeth in a grin, unmistakably a grin of malign intelligence. The gesture vividly recalled Dearth to my mind. I had described him as equine, and if proof of the world's aptness were needed, Dandy had supplied that proof. "He's coming back," Monica murmured to me on my return to the house. "Ill, I think. He's gone to lie down. Have you seen Dandy?" "Yes, and I hope not to see him again." But I was to see him again. Twice again. The first time was that same night, from my bedroom window. Both my bedroom and my cousin's room looked out upon the grassy hill of which I spoke. It rose for a few yards until almost level with the second story of the house, and then abruptly curved away. Somewhere about midnight, feeling restless and troubled by my thoughts, I got out of bed and went to the window to take an airing. I was not the only restless creature that night. Standing not 20 yards away, with the sky for background, was a great horse. The moonlight made its white flank gleam like silver and lit up the eyes that stared fixedly at my window. For 16 days and nights we lived, Monica and I, in the presence of this fear. A fear nonetheless real for being non-susceptible of definition. The climax came suddenly, without any sort of warning, unless Dearth's idiotic hostility towards myself could be regarded as a warning. The utterly unfounded idea that I was making love to his wife had taken root in the man's mind, and every day his manner to me became more openly vindictive. This was the cue for my departure, with warm thanks for my delightful holiday. But I didn't choose to take it. I wasn't exactly in love with Monica, but she was my comrade in danger, and I was reluctant to leave her to face her nightmare terrors alone. The most cheerful room in that house was the kitchen, with its red-tiled floor, its oak rafters, and its great open fireplace. And when in the evenings the lamp was lit and we sat there listening in comfort to the everlasting gale that raged round the house, I could almost have imagined myself happy, had it not been for the presence of my reluctant host. He was a skeleton at a feast, if you like. By God, we were a genial party. From 7 o'clock to 10, we would sit there, the three of us, fencing off silence with the most pitiful of small talk. On this particular night, I had been chaffing him gently, though with intention, about his fancy for keeping a loaded rifle hanging above the kitchen mantelpiece. But at last I sickened of the pastime and the conversation, which had been sustained only by my efforts, lapsed. I stared at the red embers in the grate, stealing a glance now and again at Monica to see how she was enduring the discomfort of such a silence. The cheap alarm clock ticked loudly in the way that cheap alarm clocks have. When I looked again at Dearth, he appeared to have fallen asleep. I say appeared, for I instantly suspected him of shamming sleep in order to catch us out. I knew that he believed us to be in love with each other, and his total lack of evidence must have occasioned him hours of useless fury. I suspected him of the most melodramatic intentions, of hoping to see a caress pass between us that would justify him in making a scene. In that scene, as I figured, the gun over the mantelpiece might play an important part. I don't like loaded guns. The sight of his closed lids exasperated me into a bitter speech designed for him to overhear. "Monica, your husband is asleep. He is asleep only in order that he may wake at a chosen moment and pour out the contents of his vulgar little mind upon our heads." This tirade astonished her, as well it might. She glanced up first at me, then at her husband, and upon him her eyes remained fixed. "He's not asleep," she said, rising slowly out of her chair. "I know he's not," I replied. By now she was at his side, bending over him. "No," she remarked coolly. "He's dead." At those words, the wind outside redoubled its fury, and it seemed as though all the anguish of the world was in its wail. The spirit of Dearth's farm was crying aloud in a frenzy that shook the house, making all the windows rattle. I shuddered to my feet, and in the moment of my rising, the wail died away. And in the lull, I heard outside the window a sudden sound of feet, of pouring horses' feet. My horror found vent in a sort of desperate mirth. "No, not dead. James Dearth doesn't die so easily." Shocked at my levity, she pointed mutely to the body in the chair, but a wild idea possessed me, and I knew that my wild idea was the truth. "Yes," I said, "that may be dead as mutton, but James Dearth is outside, come to spy on you and me. Can't you hear him?" I stretched out my hand to the blind cord. The blind ran up with a rattle, and pressed against the window, looking in upon us, was the face of the white horse, its teeth bared in a malevolent grin. Without losing sight of the thing for a moment, I backed towards the fire. Monica, divining my intention, took down the gun from its hook and yielded it to my desirous fingers. I took deliberate aim and shot. And And then, with the crisis over as I thought, my nerves went to rags. I sat down limply, Monica huddled at my feet, and I knew with a hideous certitude that the soul of James Dearth, violently expelled from the corpse that lay outside the window, was in the room with me, seeking to re-enter that human body in the chair. There was a long moment of agony during which I trembled on the verge of madness, and then a flush came back into the dead, pallid cheeks. The body breathed. The eyes opened. I had just enough strength left to drag myself out of my seat. I saw Monica's eyes raised to mine. I can never for a moment stop seeing them. 3 hours later, I stumbled into the arms of the station master, who put me in the London train under the impression that I was drunk. Yes, I left alone. I told you I wasn't a courageous man. Bailey's voice abruptly ceased. The tension in my listening mind snapped, and I came back with a jerk, as though released by a spring, to my seat in the tea shop. Bailey's queer eyes glittered across at me for a moment, and then, their light dying suddenly out, they became infinitely weary of me and of all the sorry business of living. A rationalist in grain, I find it impossible to accept the story quite as it stands. Substantially true it may be, probably is, but that it has been distorted by the prism of Bailey's singular personality, I can hardly doubt. But the angle of that distortion must remain a matter for conjecture. No such dull reflections came then to mar my appreciation of the quality of the strange hush that followed his last words. Neither of us spoke. An agitated waitress made us aware that the shop was closing, and we went into the street without a word. The rain was unremitting. I shrank back into the shelter of the porch while I fastened the collar of my mackintosh, and when I stepped out upon the pavement again, Bailey had vanished into the darkness. I have never ceased to be vexed at losing him. I never ceased to fear that he may have thought the loss not unwelcome to me. My only hope is that he may hear this and get in touch with me again, so that I may be able to discharge my debt to him. It is a debt that lies heavily on my conscience. The price of his story, less £1. Production, sound design and editing by Brenden James. Please support the Black Dog Chronicles by liking this video, sharing on your favorite social media, and subscribing. As always, we thank you for listening. This is Huw Carr.
Is it possible that you are missing out on new editions of the Black Dog Chronicles? Oh no! Don't despair. Simply remember to click the notification bell next to the subscribe button on our channel. Never miss another edition of the Black Dog Chronicles again.